Yes, you can call the meeting to order and we can start.
Okay. I'd like to call to order this special joint meeting of the Parks and Recreation Commission and the Street Tree Advisory Committee for Wednesday, February 24th, 2021. May you please have roll call?
Chair Clark. Chair McGill.
Here.
Commissioner Baker. Commissioner Feck.
Here.
Commissioner Lesnar Buxton.
Here.
Commissioner Longstreet.
Here.
Commissioner Perry. Commissioner Perry, I see you are on, but you are unmute. You need to unmute yourself. Well,
I can.
That's fine. So if you can, I can chat with him later to see if he's come on. Okay, Street Tree Advisory Committee members, Chair McPherson.
Duke, that's you. Did you respond?
Okay. Vice Chair Tremin.
Here.
Member DeMola.
Here.
Member Escobar.
Here.
And Member Reed.
Here.
Great.
Thank you all for coming. Rose, is there anybody here for public comment?
I do not, any member of the public may raise their hand and speak for 2 minutes on any item not on the agenda. We are showing a graphic on how to do that. I do not see any raised hands.
Okay. I did receive word that Commissioner Perry is present. I don't know why he's not able to be heard, just for the record. Oh, there he is.
He's still self-muted, but we can see him. So, okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So welcome to our Brown Act training.
I guess that would be me.
There you are.
Honorable.
Oh, there he is. We have Dan Henschke, the Assistant City Attorney, for today's presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for sticking around for this meeting, and I'm happy to be here with you. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Dan Henschke. I'm one of the Assistant City Attorneys. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is going through basically a portion of a presentation that I've made many times throughout the state to many public officials throughout the state relating to the Brown Act, and also certain ethical principles that I think will help guide you in your work as public officials for the city. And we're scheduled for 45 minutes. I have 37 slides. I hope that we get through this very quickly. If you do have questions while I'm going through the presentation, feel free to interrupt me at any time if we want to drill down into anything. I recognize that for some of you, some of the things that I'll be talking about is pretty basic stuff, and you've heard it before. On the other hand, there are some of you that this might be new information for. So please feel free to interrupt me anytime. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the theme of this presentation is the public business. Next slide, please. My objective here is to, as I've already indicated, familiarize you with some of the principles relating to the state's open meeting laws, ethical principles and ethical laws that drive your decision making as a public official. One of the things that I've always encouraged throughout every presentation that I've ever made on this subject, and a lot of the rest of the subject covers ethical principles, is to encourage you to think beyond the legal restrictions and to provide you maybe some tools for doing that. The law is the floor, if you will, not the ceiling for conduct. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, that little sign, my job is to keep you from falling off a cliff. So the first key takeaway at the end of this presentation is expect to do the public business in an open and accountable manner. As a public official, that is the minimum requirement that you need to meet in performing your job. The next slide, please. The second takeaway goes to the principles we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, and that is to ensure fairness in your decision making by respecting and following the procedural rules, treating everyone respectfully and fairly, and without personal bias or prejudice in your decision making. If you can't make a decision without being fair and interjecting a personal bias, then you maybe ought not be participating in that particular decision. If your mind is already made up before you start working on something, then you really can't give a fair hearing to the individual that you might be affecting or the public itself. Could I have the next slide, please? I want to talk first about government transparency laws. Next slide, please. The right to a transparent government is fundamental to California law, and frankly, throughout the United States, virtually all states have some form or another of a sunshine law. In California, that sunshine law is known as the Brown Act, but it's also incorporated directly into the California Constitution in Article 1, Section 3, which establishes as a fundamental right of the public for the public's business to be done openly and publicly. Next slide, please. The purpose of these laws is that public officials conduct their business in an open manner. It is the people's business after all. And so what you're doing as a representative of the people is acting on their behalf in making your decisions. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, before I go further, I believe you were all provided a copy of a publication called Open and Public 5. It's a handbook on the Brown Act. It drills down to a lot of more detail. Just for your information, Open and Public 5, your current city attorney, Ariel Colon, was one of the co-authors. I was one of the co-authors of Open and Public 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've been involved. This office has been involved heavily in the preparation of that publication. In addition to state law, the city charter requires that city business be conducted in an open and public manner. The city charter basically follows and implements the Brown Act. Next slide, please. Big picture, what do the open meeting laws mean? Meetings of legislative bodies must be open to the public. Secret meetings and closed sessions are strictly limited. Agendas must be posted, and the items that can be discussed are limited to those items that are posted on the agenda unless you follow certain rules for adding items to the agenda. And public participation in public decision making must be guaranteed. Now, that doesn't mean that the public gets to participate in your deliberations, but they do get to attend the meetings, and they do have an opportunity to comment on things that you're taking up at a meeting. Next slide, please. So who does the Brown Act apply to? Well, it applies to local legislative bodies of local agencies. It applies to elected officials even before they've taken office. So if somebody gets, for example, elected to the city council, and from the time that the vote is known to the time they actually take office, they're subject to the Brown Act, even though they're not yet a public official. The Brown Act doesn't apply to staff, but as we'll get to later, staff can actually potentially cause a violation of the Brown Act by acting as an intermediary. And so where does the Brown Act apply? It applies to formal meetings such as a regular meeting or this special meeting, but it also applies to informal meetings. And we'll get into what some of those informal meetings are a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what is a legislative body? The Brown Act uses the term legislative body. Well, the legislative body is the city council, boards, and commissions such as the Parks and Recreation Commission and the Street Tree Advisory Committee. It also applies to standing committees of other legislative bodies. And a standing committee is a committee of a larger legislative body that has a ongoing subject matter jurisdiction or is established as a more or less permanent body. The Brown Act doesn't apply to temporary committees that are comprised of less than a majority of a legislative body. So for example, if the Parks and Recreation Commission established a temporary advisory committee to study a specific problem, that temporary advisory committee could meet in private without complying with the Brown Act, as long as it's established as a temporary committee and is less than a quorum. And interestingly, this is just for additional information, certain private corporations and LLCs that are created by government bodies to exercise delegated authority, they too can be subject to the Brown Act. And also private corporations that are funded by a city and have a voting member from the city council are also subject to the Brown Act. So it's not just elected bodies and appointed boards and commissions. Next slide, please. So what is a meeting? And a meeting is very broadly defined. It's essentially any congregation of a majority of the members of a legislative body in the same time, in the same location, and that includes teleconferencing, and as you'll hear later, emails and potentially social media, to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the body. Now, this is extremely broad, and the reason I want to emphasize this is that you can be at a meeting where all you're doing is listening. You don't have to talk. And so yeah, that's something to keep in mind. What is the subject matter jurisdiction of the body? It's whatever the charge is for the decision of that body. And it may vary from body to body. The jurisdiction of the city council basically has to do with anything that the city does. The jurisdiction of the Parks and Recreation Commission is limited to what your charge is. The jurisdiction of the Planning Commission is a little bit different. But in many respects, you know what it is that you are supposed to be meeting about or can't meet about. The exceptions to a meeting are very limited. And there is the ability, for example, to attend a meeting of another legislative body or to attend a conference or to actually attend a social event or to attend certain activity sponsored by another agency. But there's a caveat to all of those. And that is whenever you're in one other setting where you're all grouped together, you can't talk about matters that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body to which you belong. And an example of this that I like to use is oftentimes members of public agencies attend conferences. And they might all want to sit at the same table during lunch. Can they do that? Yes. But they can't talk about the business of that body while they're at lunch. If you're doing it at a conference, maybe not so suspicious. If you're doing it at a local restaurant, people wonder why members of a body would all sit together and how they could possibly not talk about the business. So you need to be careful when you're in outside settings and you're all together in the same, at the same table to make sure that you don't talk about any city business. Next item, please. Next slide, please. One of the things that the Brown Act specifically prohibits are serial meetings. And a serial meeting is essentially any type of series of communications of any kind, either directly or indirectly or through media intermediaries to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So what can those be? Next slide, please. This slide is a little bit out of order. Staff briefings are not meetings so long as staff does not communicate to members of the legislative body any comments or positions of any other member or members of the legislative body. I don't know if the Street Advisory Committee or the Parks and Recreation Commission has staff, individual staff briefings with the Parks and Recreation Director or others. But if you do, the director won't be able to share what you tell her with anybody else. And it won't be able to act on what you say in those meetings. Those are simply one-on-one communications between you and the staff. The other thing I would like to pause about here is that it's okay for commission members outside of a meeting to talk to each other one-on-one or even one-on-two. What you cannot do is share what one person tells you with another person. That starts becoming a serial meeting. And so one-on-one communications are okay, but they're risky, particularly when you tell another person what you might be thinking about doing on an upcoming agenda item. Next item, please. Next slide, please.
Question.
Yes.
you had said city business, discussing city business, and frequently what's on our agenda would be city business. But we're, as you surmise, we might be in a training session or something, and we are all at that training session, and we discuss how these things that are being discussed in the meeting might apply to what we do in our business, in our application as Street Tree Advisory Commission members. How do we determine, I mean, city business is extremely broad. How do we determine whether or not this is city business or not?
Well, sure. That's actually a really, really good question. If you're talking about a general item of, okay, so what do you think about the general idea of complying with the Brown Act? That's something that you could probably talk about at one of these commissions. But if you're if somebody says at the conference, in order to have an effective agenda, you ought to do this as part of your process, and you sit around at lunch and you say, gee, we should change our agenda process and our meeting process to implement that, and you start talking about that topic around lunch. That's the discussion of something that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Street Tree Advisory Committee, because one of the things you do is decide how to run your own meetings. And so that's an example of how sitting around outside of a meeting would be a violation. What you would do is you say, I think we need to put that topic on our next agenda so we can have a discussion about how we should run our meetings, but you do that at a meeting. Does that answer your question, or should I go into that further?
If you could go a step further, because for instance, if the Street Tree Advisory Committee has had a meeting recently and we're all in discussion after a meeting has taken place and we've deliberated and made decisions and disseminated those decisions to the city, can we discuss the items that we've already decided on and determined our decision on after the fact without fear of crossing the Brown Act restrictions?
In short, not if you do it with a majority of the other members. No. And the reason is, even though you've made your decision, that's something that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the committee. You don't lose jurisdiction of the subject matter just because you decided that particular issue. And so if you want to have a subsequent discussion about something that you've already decided, you need to put it back on the agenda and use the process for either rescinding your prior action or taking some other action. But you should not be discussing a decision even after it's made.
And you feel that
not with a majority.
And you feel that holds even if our decision cannot be rescinded, has already been established and communicated to administrative processes, et cetera. Meaning that we cannot change our decision, but we could discuss the decision we made. And you're saying, no, even that is not allowed, even though the decision cannot be modified.
My answer to that is no, is yes, you cannot. Yes, you cannot do that. Yes, you cannot do that.
Thank you.
And basically the idea is that you are continuing to discuss and deliberate matters that you ought to discuss and deliberate in public. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so what are types of unlawful serial meetings? And I have a picture of a chain and a picture of a wagon wheel. And these are common examples of different types of serial meetings. The chain represents one person talking to the next person, talking to the next person, talking to the next person. And pretty soon you come around and it's like the game of telephone, where it starts going around and everybody has heard what everybody else is saying. The wagon wheel is you have one person who is acting as the hub and as the go-between between all of the other persons who are having the conversation. But any type of communication that has the end result of a majority of the members of a legislative body communicating to each other about a subject matter, something that's within the subject matter jurisdiction, is a serial meeting and a violation of the law. And it can happen in a variety of different manners. Frankly, emails is one of the biggest hazards and the most common ways that the Brown Act can be violated. And why does that happen? Because people are in the habit of hitting reply to all. Somebody will send a one-way communication and it'll be copied to all of the members of a legislative body, and somebody will hit reply to all, and it goes out to everybody, and the next person will, and pretty soon it's all out there. So my recommendation is if you're going to send emails that have any other member of the commission or on it, don't use the reply to all feature. It just doesn't help you in any way. Next item, please. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about social media because this is a brand new law that went into effect on January 1st, 2021. I'm the chair of the League's Brown Act Committee, and the League's Brown Act Committee actually helped draft this legislation. Basically, what the legislation does is it amends the Brown Act to allow members of legislative bodies to use local internet platforms that are open and accessible to the public to answer questions, provide information to the public, or solicit information from the public regarding matters that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. And you can't do that, though, if it's a closed chat room or internet platforms that are not open to the general public free of charge. And so in any platform that requires somebody to be accepted as a member or can be controlled by any party cannot be used for the Brown Act to avoid the Brown Act. The prohibition against discussion among a majority of the members remains in force. In other words, you can't use social media to conduct a serial meeting. And what that means for under this new law is that on social media, members of a legislative body are prohibited from responding directly to the communication regarding a matter of city business made or shared by other members of a legislative body. So what's the key takeaway here? If you're going to use social media to communicate about city business, and a post pops up from another member of the Parks and Recreation Committee, if you're on the Parks and Recreation Committee, or the Street Tree Advisory Committee, if you're on the Street Tree Advisory Committee, don't post an emoji. Don't like it. Don't respond to it. Don't react in any way to that post. This is a brand new law. It does allow you to use, and I know that a lot of public officials, particularly council members and others, will use social media to solicit input from their constituents, to communicate information out to the constituents, to get information out. But once you start reacting to other members of the body, you can't do that under the new law. Next slide, please.
I have a question.
Yep.
So say a council member posts something about city business that's not my city business, and it's nothing under my jurisdiction or anything I will make a decision about. Can I like that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. It's restricted. The liking and not liking is restricted to the members of the legislative body themselves. I will warn you, however, if if you do comment on social media about something that's likely to come up before you as a commissioner or a committee member, you ought to think twice about whether or not you want to send that like or that post, because it may be seen by some as prejudging a matter that comes before you. So that you just need to be cautious about that.
But what about
Um,
even, like, could someone on the Street Tree Advisory Committee or Parks Commission put a post about the environmental benefits of trees and how we should cherish them all and keep them? Like, would that be seen as prejudging any situation that would come before us?
No, that's a generalized comment. What I'm really concerned about is that uh, if you talk about the benefits of parks, if you talk about the benefits of trees, if you post something about a program that's coming up, if you say, oh, by the way, there's something coming up on the agenda of general public interest, you might be interested, that would be okay. But one of the things you need to be concerned about is, let's suppose there's something on the agenda about we're gonna remove the Morton Bay fig tree down by State Street, okay? And that's coming up. And you post a post that says, hey, everybody in the Sierra Club, my friends in the Sierra Club, this is on the agenda. You need to come down to the meeting. It's really, really important. That might be seen as potentially prejudging how you want to decide that issue. Now, that's a pretty outrageous example, but the idea is it could be seen as indicating you've already made your mind up before you've even walked into the meeting. Okay.
Mhm.
And by the way, nobody wants that.
So the standards are, it could be seen as, and we have to anticipate that it might be seen as in a certain light, and that's pretty mushy.
You know why it's mushy? Because there is no clear standard, and it varies from situation to situation. And so what I'm suggesting is that you need to use your judgment in doing that kind of activity. And if you have a question about it, give me a call. It's the kind of thing I'd be happy to talk through with you, because we all have to realize that in the new way of doing business is instantaneous communication over a mass media format, and things that we used to do by talking individually one-on-one with people are now becoming things that we do by talking instantaneously to many, many people. And so you have to be aware that there's a different context and different ramification of those kinds of social media postings. It's just something to think about. There's no, it's not illegal, but it might have an impact on the decision. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Basically, okay, this slide is just about agendas. Very quickly, generally what the agenda requirements are: 72 hours before regular meetings, 24 hours before special meetings. You have to have an agenda description, and you need to, in that agenda description, describe sufficiently to the public so that they know what's going on at the meeting. The agenda has to specify the time, place, and location of the meetings. And you've noticed that our agendas have changed since COVID, because the place of the meeting is essentially a virtual meeting room. Next item, please. Or next slide, please. Because you can't take action or discussion on items not appearing on the agenda, it's imperative that staff has the items on the agenda with a sufficient description to let the public reasonably know what the actions are that might be taken at the meeting with regard to that item. We generally do that. You'll notice the city council meetings have a general description, and then they have the recommended action underneath the general description that tells the public what's going on. Next item, or next slide, please. We know about public participation rights. I'm not going to dwell on this this issue. Next item, next slide, please. I only put this slide on for closed sessions to be complete. Basically, I can't think of a circumstance that either the Park and Recreation Commission or the Street Tree Advisory Committee would ever need to go into closed session. So we're gonna, but the closed sessions are specifically limited. You can only have a closed session if it's specifically authorized by the Brown Act and it's specifically noted on the agenda, or in certain circumstances done in a way that if an item comes up on the agenda, you can go into closed session because of a special circumstance. But this really doesn't apply to either of your legislative bodies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. If you ever are in a legislative body that can have a closed session, you need to understand that you can't disclose to others outside of the closed session any information that you receive in that closed session, subject to certain very limited exceptions. For example, if there's an illegal meeting that you believe is illegal, you can disclose it to the DA. But generally, leaks out of closed session are a violation of the Brown Act. Next slide, please. A word about people talking at public meetings. Basically, if somebody wants to come and criticize your activities, they can do that. The Brown Act specifically says that criticism of public officials is allowed. I don't know what, you can remove people who may disrupt the meetings, but a person disrupting a meeting is very, very narrow, and it means really actually preventing the meeting from going forward. If somebody wants to video or photo in the meeting, they can do that, as long as they can do it in a manner that doesn't disrupt the meeting. We televise our meetings, so this really isn't an issue. Next item, or next slide, please. There's no such thing as a secret ballot. All actions have to be taken in public. When you have a video teleconference like we're doing now, all the votes have to be by roll call vote, and that kind of solves the issue of secret ballots for teleconference and video conference meetings. This used to come up and a lot, for example, in the selection or appointment of things like chair and vice chair. Everybody wanted to do a secret ballot, and because nobody wanted to hurt anybody's feelings, that even that kind of a procedural vote has to be done publicly and announced publicly. Next slide, please. And what you can see from the theme of all of this is that the public business gets conducted publicly. We don't keep secrets from the public in the conduct of our official business. Certain Brown Act penalties, in some instances, the action that's taken can be nullified or set aside. Intentional violations of the Brown Act are misdemeanors. There are attorney's fees and costs that can be paid, and you know, one of the biggest penalties, I guess, is a violation of the Brown Act results in really, really bad press and bad social media and bad just bad press all the way around. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about fair process laws, and this I think is important because it relates to the manner in which a legislative body conducts its decision-making process. We've just talked about you do everything in public, and you don't conduct meetings or city business and private. But now let's talk about the decision-making process itself. Next slide, please. So what is due process? Well, largely it's a concept that requires you to give notice and an opportunity to be heard and to have a fair and impartial decision maker. Generally, this concept of due process applies in what we call quasi-judicial proceedings, and that is where you're applying a set of criteria to a specific set of facts. It doesn't apply in legislative context where you're setting general principles for future conduct or establishing a general idea. And I guess the best way I could describe it, if you're approving a park master plan that applies to all parks, that's a decision that you have a much broader discretion in how you conduct the process because it's affecting future conduct and everybody generally. If you're deciding a specific issue about whether or not you're going to remove a person's tree, that's in the nature of a quasi judicial hearing, and they are entitled to a greater degree of impartiality and fairness in that decision-making process. Next slide, please. Examples of situations where you might not be providing due process is where you have a personal interest in the outcome of the matter, where you have personal animosity against a particular applicant, where you have pre-existing opposition to a specific project. These are all commonly known under the term of bias. If you walk in where you're biased and you've predetermined the outcome, then you might want to consider whether or not you are giving the parties due process and whether or not you can make a fair decision based upon what's presented before you. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't go into a meeting with an idea of what you think the right answer is after the reading of the staff report, living in the city, knowing what the circumstances are, but being able to have your mind changed is kind of the essence to being unbiased, and also making sure that you don't have a personal stake in the outcome. If you have a personal stake in the outcome, the law is going to presume that you made a decision based upon that personal stake in the outcome. And then that would be improper bias. Next slide, please. So what are some best practices to help deal with the decision-making process? Avoid making statements that would indicate that your mind is made up before the matter is even heard. Think fairness and merit-based decisions in contracting decisions, in all decisions that you have coming before you. Don't make decisions based upon personal relationships. If you have to recommend a contract, for example, something that comes before you as a Parks and Recreation Commission on a contract to recommend to the City Council, you need to consider it on the merits and not upon personal relationships. By the way, public bidding laws are basically merit-based decision-making, and part of public bidding laws are to avoid personal relationships in contracting decisions. The other primary best practice is make sure you listen during public meetings. And I frankly have been at meetings where not of agencies I represented, because I admonished them not to do this, but of others, where the board members, council members, were on their cell phones, were we're getting up and leaving the meeting for long periods of time and coming back. We're obviously not paying attention to what's going on. And it shows an extreme amount, a lack of respect, not only for the persons who are involved, but for the decision-making process itself, and it shows unfairness. Next slide, please. A lot of these decisions can be guided by general ethical principles, and ethics is the thing, is what one ought to do. It's the kind of behaviors that would make the world a better place, especially if everybody engaged with them. And to determine what one ought to do, go to the root of the matter and think in terms of values. And so I do a whole training session on ethics in government. This is just one slide. But the whole idea here is that there are certain core values that we all honor in our daily life. And when you apply those to government, you get a better decision-making process. And what you want to walk away from the decision is even if somebody is disappointed with your decision, they won't think they got an unfair shake. They won't think that they weren't listened to. They may not have been agreed with, but at least they got a fair decision. Next slide, please. These ethical qualities that are pretty much universal, honesty, personal responsibility, harmlessness, respect for others, fairness and justice. You may have other values, but if you would take the core values that you have and apply them to your job as a committee member or commissioner, I think you'll be much better in the position that you're in. Next slide, please. The city of Santa Barbara has its own organizational values that it applies throughout the city. These include providing service to the community in a fair, courteous, responsive, and effective manner, and having an open government, and having citizen participation. Next slide, please. These are just more of the ethical principles that are part of the city's organizational values. These apply primarily to staff, but they apply to just anyone who's working for the city. Well, by the way, one of the ethical principles that I've always found very important in all of the cities and other public agencies that I've worked throughout my career is honoring the decision-making process. And what I mean is, if you have let's say a 5-member city council, and the council votes 3-2 on a decision, it's done and you move on. If the planning commission had voted, in another city, I had a 5-member planning commission. They voted 3-2 to approve the project. That decision was the decision that was communicated to the city council, and the members of the commission would honor that decision and move on to the next decision. Okay, now, and that's just part of the kind of the ethical values of the organization. Next slide, please. This is more of the organizational. I put these up here because they're part of a presentation that I've given to city staff, and I wanted to make sure that you at least saw what city staff have seen. Next slide, please. Again, just more of these. You can see them: candor, honesty, integrity, accountability are ways to earn the public trust. Next slide, please. Again, just more of these ethical or organizational values. Next slide, please. That concludes the formal presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you want to have a dialogue about some of the things that I've said, I'd be be happy to do so. Otherwise, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to come and talk with you. And again, if any of you have any questions about anything I've talked about, if you want to have a one-on-one conversation, please feel free. You can send me an email, or you can call me, and I will be happy to respond and talk with you about any of these topics.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, well, again, thank you very much. And
I have a question.
oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. This is Tony with the STAC committee. Let's say we have something we feel we want to communicate to other members of our committee, and it's before the next meeting would be due, and we wanted to initiate it before. What's the best way to address that?
Okay, so give me a little bit more information about what you would want to do.
You know, I'm just being hypothetical here.
Okay.
I'm not even sure, but let's say we had let me think here. We have looked at some trees, and we feel that we have a question I want to purvey to everybody and get some feedback. And I just want to make sure that it's something that is attended to by the next meeting. What would be the best way to put that out there?
Okay, that's a really good question. If it's something that you feel that you need to have an answer to prior to the meeting that's going to be germane, my recommendation is not to try to get it from the other members of the commission, but to communicate that question to staff. Let staff know that you have this question, and then staff can present the answer to the question. If it's individual to you, either directly back to you, or if it's something that the entire committee would be interested in, they can actually present that as part of the staff report at the next meeting. But if you want to communicate to other members of the committee about what you're thinking about the project, my recommendation is wait until the meeting. And the reason for that is that way everybody has the opportunity to hear it at the same time and to discuss it as part of the meeting. But if you have a specific question, communicate it to staff so that staff can answer the question.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Are all of our emails subject to Freedom of Information Act, so they're all able to be gotten?
That's a really interesting question.
Mhm.
You said all of your emails.
And all of our emails that pertain to Parks and Recreation.
Okay. All right. Okay. You were about to take me down a rabbit hole on the use of your personal computer for private and city business. Let's just stick it to yes, your emails relating to city business are public records. Now, whether they are and they were potentially subject to disclosure. Whether you have to keep them, that's a different issue. No, if your practice is to send an email and delete and things like that, you can manage your personal email. But if you're using a city email account, or if you're even using your private email account to conduct city business, the communications that you send, the emails you send, are records that are subject to disclosure. So that being said, you can generally, unless you have an email that is a privileged communication or not subject to disclosure, assume that anything you say about city business in an email will be disclosed to the public if asked. If you have it.
But if it goes to a city employee, then it's probably,
If it goes to a city employee, it's clearly a public record. If it goes to another commissioner, it is a public record and potentially subject to disclosure. There have been judicial decisions. The California Supreme Court has actually weighed in on this topic, and public officials have actually had their personal computers searched for emails related to city business or public business.
and I assume that would apply to text messages also.
Yes. Okay, think of text messages as the notes that you would pass in class.
Mhm.
That if they get intercepted, they will be read, aloud to everybody. But yeah, if you're doing city business through text or whatever, it is a record potentially subject to disclosure.
Okay, thank you. I think that's hard for all of us to wrap our heads around personally.
It is, I'll be honest with you, it's very hard to wrap your heads around. And I have an iPhone. I do not have a separate city iPhone. I am taking the risk that at some point somebody may ask to see my iPhone and what's on it. But on the other hand, my personal practice is I don't generally do city business through text. I just don't do, and my emails are any city email that I send is always on the city exchange. I don't use my private email account to do any city business. But that's just me.
Well, and those of us that are volunteers don't have a city account, so.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so if you're using your private email to communicate with staff, the email that you send to staff will be part of the city's email system. If you keep your email, it may be subject to disclosure. Am I saying that you have to archive everything and keep it? No. You can control your email on your side. In other words, you have the right to take out your own trash. and empty your own wastebasket. For example, I set my private computer, my email settings are set to every time I close out of Outlook, it deletes everything in my wastebasket. It just does. Any other questions?
No more questions?
Yes, I have one.
Please, Jacob.
Say if there's an important decision coming up, can I tell someone at my job to write a letter about this decision?
I think that was if an important decision is coming up. Can you tell someone at your job about the decision?
And have them write a letter in support or opposition to the decision?
Oh.
I'm not sure I completely understand, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Jill?
Yeah, Commissioner Lesnar Buxton is asking if he is able to communicate or share with someone that an important city decision is about to be made, and is he able to express his opinion to that individual regarding the decision to be made?
Thank you. Yes, as long as it's not another, yeah, and the answer is yes. You are allowed to have one-on-one communications about city business. And you are allowed to express your opinions to others. What you don't want to do is say that you have made up your mind about something before you go in, particularly if it affects others and it's coming up for a decision. You can solicit the opinion of other people. In some instances, if you ask somebody what do they think about this, you might need to disclose that when you have the hearing, and you can do that by simply saying, you know, I was talking to my neighbor and my neighbor said this. Can you help me by answering that question? As a public official, you're expected to talk to members of the public. You're expected to be representative of the public. What you can't do under the Brown Act and what you can't do under the fairness laws is communicate to other members of your legislative body. So you can't talk to other members outside, and at least you can't talk to a majority of the other members outside. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
And if I could jump in for clarification, I think sometimes Street Tree Advisory Committee members or Parks and Recreation Commission members are aware of a decision that the city council is about to make, that they may or may not have made a recommendation related to that decision. And I think both the committee members and the commissioners would want to know, can they, you know, to what extent can they share that the city council might be making a big decision on something, which may or may not have been business before either body. It just could be, you know, a decision of the council on any topic related to city business.
Sure, that's a good. Okay, thank you, Jill. That's a good question. Yes, you are authorized as a citizen of Santa Barbara to talk to your representatives on the city council about anything. Where the issue comes up is when it's a matter that's come before you and you're trying to kind of go around the decision that's made by the body. That's not illegal, it's just kind of bad form. But if you're talking to a city council member about something that's coming up that's really important, that may be referred back to the commission in the future, or may not even come up to you, but is a decision that's made a long time ago, sure, you're free to talk to members of the city council, members of the public, each other, as long as when you talk to each other, you don't violate the Brown Act by having a serial meeting. Ms. Zachary, does that answer your question?
So I just want to clarify, you said it's, say an issue came before STAC or the Parks Commission, and we came to a decision, and that decision was being appealed to city council. You're saying it would be bad form for members of either STAC or the commission to talk to our council members about it?
Yeah, here's the problem. Yes, it's bad form in my opinion. And the reason is that the decision by the committee has been made and will be communicated to the city council. And it's basically what you're doing is you're trying to the minority is then trying to re-argue the decision that was made by the committee. Now, can they do that? Can you do that? Yes, it's not illegal to do that, to talk to the council. The question is, how does that fit in with the ethical values of you and the organization? That's really where the issue comes in. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's an ethical dilemma that you have to face. Do you honor the decision by the legislative body that you're on by recognizing that they will know that you voted no? Or do you feel that you need to kind of re-argue the case before the council? On the same, and on the yes side, I mean, you're already in the majority. Your position is going to be reported to the council anyway.
And it's just as easy to speak in front of council because we would have time and public comment for that anyway.
Absolutely, if that's what you choose to, that's what you choose to do. And so again, this is the part of the presentation that goes to ethical principles and ethical values. And what do you as a commissioner want to do? As a lawyer, what I can tell you is it's not illegal. In most instances, and when I say in most instances, because if something's going to come back to you, and there are situations where you might have a bias situation, but that doesn't come up very often. But the question is really, how do you, as a body, conduct your business in a manner in which you'll be able to continue to function as a body? Because what I've experienced in my over 40 years of representing public agencies is that if members of boards and commissions start doing an end run, if they're on the minority, around and going to the council, there gets to be really hard feelings, and the decision-making process can tend to break down. The other thing that you have to avoid is that if you're communicating after the decision has been made and talking to members of the same body about it, you can have a potential Brown Act violation because you're essentially relitigating the decision after it has been made out of a public meeting, and that's a violation of the Brown Act.
Can I just jump in one more time? Because I don't know if committee members or commissioners have this question, but based in my years of being a staff liaison to a committee or commission, I think there are times when let's take the commission, since the recommendations of the commission are appealable to the city council, and the commission also makes recommendations on matters related to Parks and Recreation business, whether it's the budget, whether it's advancing a certain project or program. Staff may have gone to the commission, staff went to the commission to ask for their recommendation, and now it's going before council. Commissioners live in the city of Santa Barbara. They interact with people throughout the city of Santa Barbara, friends, colleagues, you name it. And someone may ask them their opinion on a matter that they acted on that's now before the commission. I think I sometimes get questions from commissioners, am I allowed to talk about what we talked about? And my response has been yes, and it's also in the public record. And so I think sometimes there's some reluctance on the part of commissioners to say, this was my opinion and I voted this way because, outside of a public meeting.
Yes, you are always allowed to explain your decision to anyone, and you're allowed to talk to anyone. That's not what I'm suggesting is a problem at all. It's when reporting what you did and what you thought turns to advocacy. If you start really pushing it, that it becomes an issue. That's it's a fine line. If a council member says, well, why did you vote against something? You say, because of this, that, and the other thing. Why did you vote in favor of it? Because this, that. You're allowed to say that. That's not a problem. Or tell your neighbors. Or to write a letter to the editor. That's not it's not a violation of the law. People might wonder what your motives are, but that's not a violation of the law. I'll give you an example. We had a council member when I was city attorney in this small city of Solana Beach, who, when she didn't get her way, would write a letter to the editor explaining her position. And it really made all of the other council members mad. The other council members would come to me and say, is there anything we could do about it? And the answer was, not really, because she has a right to write a letter to the end. She's not violating the law. But they really, really didn't like it. And it kind of became known that it was frowned upon. So after a while, she kind of stopped. It wasn't illegal. It was just, it really made everybody upset. And it made the council a little dysfunctional for a while because of the personal dynamics. That's not a legal issue. That's just a human nature issue. But it wasn't illegal.
That's kind of a silly question. Why does this Brown Act training have to be a public meeting when it's just a training? We're not coming to any kind of decision on city business. We're just learning.
That's a good question. It's because you're all meeting at the same time and in the same place to hear a matter relating to the subject matter jurisdiction of the body, which is how do you conduct your meetings? And then the questions that you're asking relate to how do you conduct your meetings? I have done this kind of training to an audience of as small as 5 to as big as 500. And it's actually a longer full 2-hour training session. In those full 2-hour training sessions, those fell into the exception for meetings if there was because they were open. They were basically, it was at a conference, and individual members weren't discussing among themselves matters within the subject matter jurisdiction of their body. But here, we're all together. If I couldn't do this training to you unless I either did it individually to each of you or small groups of you, or we did it in a much larger group setting that was open to a lot of people, and we weren't all talking about the same thing together. But that's why. Sorry, that's a long answer, but that's why.
One last question. Well, hopefully it's the last question. I'll try to make it quick. Because of the COVID restrictions now, we are going out and inspecting trees on a one by one basis, meaning we go out ourselves. The odds are very high and likely that we will interact with possibly the public, being either the owner of the property or a neighbor of the property or anybody in general inquiring what we're doing and what our thoughts are about whether a tree should be removed or not. And it sounds like because they are the public, we can interact with them and express our feelings either objectively or subjectively. But I'm wondering if that is a wise thing to do.
Whether it's a wise thing to do is an individual choice. I do recommend, however, if you go out into the public, use that as an information gathering as opposed to decision communicating forum. You know, you can ask questions, you can get information, you can find out what they say. And then when you come to the meeting, you can say, when I was on my inspection, I learned the following, or I had a question came to my attention, or whatever. And that way, what you're doing is you're not only giving everybody else the value of the input that you received when you went and talked to the citizen, in the community, but you're also demonstrating that you haven't made your mind up because you haven't told anybody how you intend to vote in advance. It's really, frankly, it's never a really good idea on something that involves an applicant to express how you're going to vote before you actually have the meeting. It's just that's when you kind of get into trouble. Does it happen very often? Yeah, but it does happen. And then when it does, it's really embarrassing because they'll say, you've already made your mind up. You're not listening to me. I saw you talking to my neighbor and you told my neighbor that there was no way you were ever going to vote for this project. And that's probably not what you said, but it probably may come out that way. So use it as an information gathering as opposed to telling people what you're thinking. Do your thinking at the public meeting.
That's a good way to do it. Thank you.
Was that the last question? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Henschke. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. So I hope it was helpful.
Okay,
Thank
It
you.
was- Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks everyone for staying late. Stay well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 We're adjourned.